Across 4 decades as a print journalist, about half that as an editor, Bruce Guthrie has witnessed one of the most turbulent periods of change in the newspaper industry from the inside. He became a headline himself after his sacking as editor-in-chief of Rupert Murdoch's biggest-selling and most profitable Australian masthead, the Melbourne Herald Sun, then sued the boss and earlier this year won a bitterly contested court case. Guthrie's various experiences with the Murdoch culture, including his David and Goliath battle, plus another rough ride through a traumatically turbulent period for the Fairfax Group as editor of The Age in Melbourne, are detailed in a book called Bites Murdoch. It's a rare insight to the two cultures, the clashes of personalities and the backroom interplay with powerful politicians. I spoke with Bruce Guthrie just before his book launch in Melbourne earlier today. Bruce Guthrie, you'd had one experience with the Murdoch machine before, 20 years before, that you walked away from. Why did you put yourself in the firing line with the same proprietor and the same culture a second time?
Well, I guess I was a victim of what people have sometimes called the Don Giovanni syndrome, Kerry, that everyone thinks they can change Rupert Murdoch. In the intervening 20 years, I'd left, I think, in 1987 or 1989 and returned in 2007. The Murdoch organisation had become global, the management at the top had changed, I had a good relationship with John Hartigan, the CEO, so I thought the time was right to re-enter the organisation.
So when you were sacked, why did you fight it, and how hard was it to decide to take on such a powerful media machine and such a powerful personality and potentially risk just about everything?
I fought it because it was unfair. I fought it because there was a total lack of respect for me and what I'd done for the company. I fought it because it was illegal, and my contract said it was illegal, and it was one of the easiest decisions of my life.
In your account of the battle Guthrie versus Murdoch, you write at one point, quote, "It was a very curious feeling to be a media victim, and I didn't like it one bit." What prompted that comment?
Well, in the month before the trial beginning, there was a report on a website that News Limited were getting together a dirt file on me. And I thought that the story appearing at that time was pressure, that it had emanated from News Limited and they were trying to put pressure on me to settle. And sure enough, the very next day, News Limited made an offer of settlement. It was a fairly paltry offer. And I thought, in a sense, I had been used, or the journalist, I think with all the good intentions in the world, had gone in search of a story, and the effect of it was to put pressure on me. And I suddenly realised, after being a victimiser all these years as a journalist, that it feels pretty uncomfortable to be in the spotlight and to be a victim.
Do you also acknowledge that the irony, or even the hypocrisy, maybe the unrealised hypocrisy of journalists who commit their careers to fighting abuses of power by perhaps the major institutions of society, but being a party to a process of inflicting abuses of power themselves?
Absolutely. I don't think journalists think through enough the impact of their journalism. And I think one of the byproducts of the internet, which has become an immediate medium, we're just banging it through again like we did on afternoon newspapers a generation ago, is that time for thinking is almost gone again. And I mean, just in the weeks during the court case and after the court case, I was sometimes astonished at some of the stuff that was written. And of course now we have the bloggers, and the bloggers are just incredibly mean-spirited and intemperate and aren't sort of bound by the things we were taught at journalism school. So I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
You recount a conversation you had with the veteran Canberra political journalist Laurie Oakes.
Yeah.
And he said, what happened, what went wrong? The paper was going great guns. And you said, I got the job right and the politics wrong.
Yeah.
Elaborate.
Well, I think within News Limited there is, and I'm talking there about the internal politics. At News Limited, the almost instinctive reaction to everything is, what will Rupert think? It doesn't matter whether you're an editor or a commercial manager or a section head, you put all the news through this kind of filter. What will Rupert think? What will the Murdoch family think? What will the corporate partners think? Is this in the business interests? And so what you end up with, if you're not careful, is a kind of homogenised, pasteurised form of journalism that comes out in the papers and online. And I wouldn't do that. And I think that probably I was, in a sense, still thinking like a journalist first and a News Limited manager second. And probably if I'd been doing it the other way around, I'd still be there.
But Looking back on your own view of your time at Fairfax, of course you also encountered serious problems with senior management at Fairfax when you ran the Age.
Well, I had 8 very, very good years at Fairfax and 3 bad months. That's the way I see it. I just happened to be caught in a very, very difficult period for Fairfax, and I'm sure they look back on it as not one of the great periods in their history. And if I came to grief at the Age, it was because the shareholding changed. I seemed to be at war with Jeff Kennett. The new owners didn't like that, and it was much easier to move on the editor or pressure the editor to move on than to kind of live with that pressure between the government and the paper.
Give me the insights that you can to the kind of interface that editors have with proprietors or with their managing directors or their boards where there is political pressure or where there is pressure from powerful, say, business interests or whatever, where there is outside pressure on that paper exerted via proprietors.
Well, I think it's changed. I started in newspapers in 1972. I became an editor for the first time in 1987. And I think in those days, those glory days of newspapers, your one stakeholder was the reader. And then sometime in the early 90s, when advertising became much more important to newspapers, suddenly you were reminded sometimes of, key advertisers. And then midway through the 90s and beyond, suddenly you were being reminded of the shareholders, because shareholder value became much more important, and newspapers were being owned by big, big companies looking to make more and more profits. And then the new one is corporate partners. Corporate partners do deals with newspapers so their events are covered or, their projects are publicised in papers. So there's all these stakeholders. And at every point, there's pressure from boards and managers to remember the stakeholders. I say in the book that an editor is really wearing 2 hats. There's the hat you wear as the kind of manager, and then there's this other hat which has got a propeller on it, because you're a creative as well, and you're expected to do 2 jobs. And I think what's happening now in 2010 is that the manager has become more important than the editor. And I think that's a problem, and it's a pity for newspapers. And I think concessions and compromises are being made on the journalism to kind of satisfy the corporate side of the business.
So tell me what it was like as the editor of the Age to be at the receiving end of a shellacking from Paul Keating as Prime Minister.
It was character building, I've got to say. It was extremely character building. But, unlike Bob Hawke, at least he didn't swear. I think that... and Paul Keating, unlike, say, Jeff Kennett, who I think still bears a grudge, 20 years later, Paul Keating was the sort of bloke that you could ring back 3 days later and, well, that was Saturday, this is Tuesday, let's move on.
John Howard?
John Howard didn't really work the press, certainly not during my time. I think I only dined with him once at the Lodge, and that was late in his prime ministership when I think he realised the polls were turning against him and he started to reach out to the media, but by then it was too late. But I always found him an eminently decent man to deal with, and, I respected him.
Kevin Rudd?
Kevin Rudd I liked, and he really worked the room, as they say. Kevin Rudd, whether it was because he was a new Prime Minister leading a new government, was a fairly constant caller to the Herald Sun. I'm talking monthly, bi-monthly, and would be big on the dinners, the one-on-one dinners. And I think he thought that if he could tap in to the editors of tabloid newspapers, he could tap into the electorate and what they thought. I'm not sure that's always the case.
But you also recount it reached a point where he was texting you from football games.
That's right, which was endlessly entertaining for my kids. But I'm not sure that editors should have that sort of relationship with any politician. I've always subscribed to the view that the closest you should be to a politician is perhaps a nodding acquaintance. So I was a little uncomfortable with that. But as soon as I lost the job, of course, the text stopped.
Well, you texted him on one occasion, you didn't get an answer.
I did. A month after I lost the job, I sort of called up his number one day and said, "Happy Christmas, Kevin," and never heard. By then I was an ex-editor and about as useful as yesterday's newspaper.
Well, it was a very public battle that you had with Jeff Kennett in Victoria, at least, and it permeated the rest of the country at times. Now, Peter Costello, you say in the book, warned you once that Kennett had rung him to castigate him for being seen to be friendly with you in a budget lockup, and Kennett had told him, Costello said, that he was going to kill them both, that is, you and the Age.
That's right. That's absolutely accurate. That was in, I think, 1996 or 1997. And we, as you say, I actually had appeared on the 7:30 report the night after the budget, and there was overlay. I think, as you, Kerry, introed the story, the selling of the budget, and there was Peter Costello and I laughing in the budget lockup as I showed him the sketch-up of page 1 of The Age, and as Peter Costello later relayed to me through our chief political correspondent at the time, Jeff Kennett rang him moments after that film appeared on the 7:30 report and said, "It's okay to like Bruce Guthrie and The Age, but I'm still going to kill both of them." And I think Mr Kennett gave it a good old try, and he probably got me, but he didn't get The Age.
Can you imagine yourself as a newspaper editor again?
Probably not. But I mean, I'd do it again. I'd do it again for all the madness. You know, as Woody Allen once said, you know, my brother thinks he's a chicken. Well, the psychologist said, tell him he isn't. He said, I would, but I need the eggs, Doc. And I need the eggs, but I'm not sure I'm ever going to get them, Kerry.
Bruce Guthrie, thanks for talking with us.
Thanks very much.
We all need the eggs.